If you have a pulse, you probably hate the subject of taxes and running the bookkeeping portion of your business. But like it or not, if you want to be a successful podcaster, you are going to have to pay attention to your numbers. But don't worry, we have the answer for you, Core Financial. Our friends over at Core Financial have taken the pressure off of us so we can focus on what we love doing most, running our podcast. They take care of all of our taxes, monthly bookkeeping, financial plans, and make sure we take full advantage of all of the tax benefits we qualify for. It just feels good knowing we aren't going to get a big surprise during tax season. If you are serious about building a business with your podcast, head on over to howtomakeapodcast.co/core to see what they can do for you. Hello and welcome to How to Make a Podcast. My name is John Bunn, and today is a special episode. Nick is not on the episode today. He's actually in the room as we record. Nick says hi, but we were recording a batch episode day today here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Our editor, Blake Pollino. Blake Pollino is here with me, and I wanted to interview Blake. Nick was like, you should interview Blake. I got to do an episode with Blake the other day. You haven't got to do one. And so I just wanted to dive deep with Mr. Blake Pollino, our editor. He is a podcaster as well. I'll let him talk about himself. Blake, say hello to How to Make a Podcast. What's good in your world, my friend?
Hello, everyone. So we are not live, but we are here in John's new house, hanging out, spending a little in-person time together, which is fun. So if you don't know this already, we live in 3 different states, Nick and John and I, so we always enjoy any time we get to be together in person, in the flesh. And so yeah, we're here recording a couple episodes, hanging out, and having some fun. Exactly.
We've eaten pizza, we've eaten pancakes.
We have eaten all the things.
We've all been eating really clean.
Yeah, it's kind of our nature. Like we all decided, like, hey, this is maybe the year that all 3 of us all get in the best shape of our lives, because we've kind of taken turns over the last couple of years. Like somebody will be like doing really good and the other 2 of us are not. And then I think finally we're all kind of in that place. And then we get together and just eat whatever we want.
Yeah. So. When we were in Las Vegas last year, we all stayed at, what was the place called that we stayed?
The Luxor, right?
The Luxor, yeah, which is like the pyramid vibe. Mm-hmm. And there was a restaurant, and there was a meal called the Pharaoh's Feast at the restaurant that we found on day 2 of 6 days of being there.
Yes.
And so day 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, we all had the Pharaoh's Feast for breakfast every single day.
Had to be no less than 2,300 calories.
Just the worst idea to start our day. But anyway, I digress, like I usually do. But here we are. We're in Tulsa. We're together. We all met up together. You flew in. Nick drove down. And we're just hanging out. We got some photos of each other yesterday, video footage, just getting promo stuff ready for the year, recording episodes. And I know bits and pieces of what you do. Mm-hmm. I know you're a podcast junkie. I listened to the episodes that you and Nick were on together, but why don't you refresh people's minds of a little basics of who you are and how you got to this couch today?
Yeah, so my name is Blake Pollino. I was hitchhiking outside of Tulsa, and John drove by and asked if I wanted to come get on the couch and do a podcast interview, so that's how I got here.
Respect.
I kid. So I met John and Nick, so we all also have wedding video companies, and John hosted a workshop here in Tulsa, actually, a few years ago, and so I came up to that. I had been listening to the wedding podcast, the How to Film Weddings podcast, since episode 1, so I was pretty kind of early into that. So John hosted a workshop, and honestly, I was like, I just want to go hang out with everybody, and learned a lot. I mean, like, I don't even know if I've told you this, but the next wedding I shot after your workshop is still to this day one of my favorite weddings I've ever shot, just because like it elevated the game like instantly. So and I really connected with John and Nick. I remember John told a story about his start in business and wedding video, and kind of like teared up a little bit, like was getting choked up. I think you had Heather up there, and it was like this real cool moment. And I remember thinking at that moment, I was like, me and this dude are going to be friends. I was like, this is going to happen. So we went to dinner that night, all of us, and Nick was there helping out with the workshop as well. So we all hung out with, had dinner. And I think that was when you guys kind of first started floating the idea of bringing an editor on to the podcast So then it wasn't long after that that I came onto the podcast, I guess around episode 30-ish, 32. Nick probably knows with his super genius episode number mind. But yeah, and then I started editing the podcast with you guys, and it made sense for me because like I was going to listen to every episode anyway. Still feel that same way about it. We now have some people that edit for us and some employees and stuff, and I still edit all of the How to Film Weddings and all of the How to Make a Podcast. I was like, I figure I'm going to listen to them anyway, so might as well edit them. But like you said before, absolute podcast junkie. I think I said this when I was on with Nick, but pretty much every waking moment of every day, if I'm not actively doing something that requires all of my attention, I'm listening to, a podcast. And so I'm just a big junkie on that and enjoy editing it. We're now producing and editing 9 podcasts under the company that I have, 2 of which are your guys, and then one is actually a podcast that I co-host that we started September of last year. And that's just really grown. We're having a lot of fun with that. So that's kind of the story.
So you mentioned this podcast that you started, and we've kind of alluded to this in the past on our podcast, but talking about niching down and like you can make money and you can build an audience no matter where you are. And it's not necessarily about getting millions of people to listen to your podcast, but the right people to listen. And if you get the right people to listen, you can really be prosperous. So why don't you tell us, let me ask you a little bit of what you did when it comes to starting this. What is this podcast? Any details you want to give us about that? But like, how'd that get going? And I know you guys started out early being sponsored, so I'd just love to know any info you're willing to give on that.
Yeah, so I want to kind of go back to something you said about having a niche down podcast as opposed to having a big one. And I think I would recommend for anybody, like having a niche down podcast is not as glamorous as having this, super popular, podcast that millions of people are listening to. But it's definitely easier, right? Because like going out and competing against these titans of the podcast industry, you're one of tens of thousands. I don't even remember what the number is, but I read it recently of how many new podcasts are popping up. And to fight in a space like, let's take, I know a podcast you and I both like, Armchair Expert, for example. Like, first off, I'm never going to get Bill Gates on my podcast. Like, that's just not, I don't have that celebrity connection. But like, I'm spinning my wheels to try to go out and to compete with something like that. So niching it down, and I joke with people that we're the most niche down podcast that I've probably ever heard of. I mean, we know exactly how big our demographic is because it's a regional podcast. So it's called the Chamber Connect podcast. So what I did is I went, I also have a commercial video company. And when we first got involved in commercial video, I went to our Chamber of Commerce. We've got a really great chamber. They're super active in the community, tons of members, lots of big businesses that are really present there. So I went to the chamber to get involved. And it was kind of like that checklist of stuff that you do when you start a business, right? Like you got to create a Facebook page, you got to make a website, and joining the chamber was like something that I thought was that, right? So I get involved with it, and I started to see that they could really benefit from video. So I offered a deal with them to work on their videos and gave them some really competitive pricing and kind of partnered with them because I knew it was going to be good exposure for us because I'm going out to these businesses to shoot little mini commercials for them. And it did. And that's a kind of whole different story, but that kind of helped explode that business. So I created this relationship with them, and we ended up doing tons of their video work, tons of their marketing work. And I started to look at it, and I had been kind of deep in the podcast game with you guys. We had started producing podcasts for other people, and I looked at it and I said, getting an audience is the hardest part, right? Finding somebody who's going to listen to your podcast is the most difficult. They already had an audience. I mean, they had this big following on social media. They had a Facebook group that had 10,000+ people in it that, they really had the attention. But the obstacle, or what I thought was an obstacle at the beginning, is it's never going to have 1 million subscribers, downloads. It's never going to have 100,000 downloads. So going into that with that expectation is, we have a county that has a little over 100,000 people in it. So to get to 100,000, we'd have to have every single person in the county listening. And we're from rural East Texas, and that's just not gonna happen. There's just a big contingent of people who still don't know what a podcast is. But there was opportunity there, and you talked about the sponsorship thing. So in addition to already having an audience built there, they also had relationships with people who were currently sponsoring things. So like business after fives and community luncheons. So they already had those relationships in place. So I approached them and put together this plan for us to produce this podcast for them as just another avenue for them to kind of bring in and generate revenue. And so from day one, so actually from our very first episode, we had three sponsors, 3 paying sponsors on our very first episode. So it's awesome. It's been really cool, and the growth has been there. Obviously, we know that there's a ceiling to it. So right now we're right around 500 downloads per episode. So every time we release, it's kind of been our trajectory. We ran ads pretty heavy at the beginning just to get that out. So like we're pretty front heavy on those. Like our first few episodes are actually some of our most popular ones. But yeah, it's been a really cool ride, really cool experience to see that happen.
That's really encouraging. And I just sit here and I think of like 20 years ago, this is just not possible.
No, not at all.
In 2001, it just barely would have been possible, maybe. But with all of the advances in technology and everything that's going on in the world, podcasting can be a great source of income for someone. I know it's several $1,000s a month that's already bringing in with your podcast at 500 people tuning in. And that's a full-time salary.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
crazy.
You could pay $100 an episode to have somebody edit it, $150, whatever. But I mean, how much time would you say you're putting into each weekly episode? Like, how much time is it taking for you to generate that?
So it's a really interesting thing. So here in recent episodes on this podcast, you've talked about batch recording. So we started batch recording from the very first day. Okay. So the way that we produce the podcast is we pick one day a month, the month before whatever these podcasts are going to release, and we schedule all of our guests. We do it in person, socially distanced, if we have to with some of these, but we bring those in and we just schedule it out, and we'll have 4 to 5 guests come in one day. And it's a long day. Like, I mean, when you batch record these, like it's like your brain's kind of fried at the end of it. But we'll prep the week before. We will come in. We shoot like there at their chambers because they've got really cool spaces. So we'll set up a set, and because we also do video on that podcast as well. And so honestly, it's it's a good 8-hour day for us to do that. So I mean, we kind of break that down, and then editing. We have a couple of employees that edit, so that do that podcast, and it's usually we're pretty fast. We can typically edit with it pretty close to whatever the runtime of an episode is. So if you've got an hour episode, it's usually pretty close to an hour, a little over that sometimes, because we're watching it or listening to it at double speed, or if it's one I'm on and I know there's not something that has to be cut out or something, it's even faster than that. But really, I would say probably a couple hours an episode, so 16 hours probably total a month.
In a month.
To generate what would equate to full-time income for someone else. It's pretty mind-boggling.
That's the insane thing is you see all these people, these influencers on YouTube or on Instagram all that's great, but there's a lot of smoke and mirrors when it comes to that. And I'm just thinking of all the listeners out there where it's just like, where's your niche of 500 listeners? I mean, with 500 listeners, like real loyal, captive audience, you can generate $2,000-$3,000 pretty easily if you have a little bit of sense when it comes to
business
who
and
could be the sponsor.
marketing and finding that target audience. And I think that's something that's so great about this podcast, for example, and How to Film Weddings and that podcast. It's really, I love that the riches are in the niches quote. That's just, it's so true to these, because if you can really find that. So there's a podcast that I'm in the process of onboarding right now that we're going to start producing and working for, and they're in the same demographic as our chamber podcast. They're another local podcast who knows that their ceiling is, basically within that community. So we're setting up ads where they're advertising on our podcast. So we're running ads on the chamber podcast for the other one, because if someone is in the community, let's take those 500 people. Like it's a really warm audience. That's a hot audience. Like, they listen to podcasts. They're already listening to a local community podcast. They're primed for this one. Yeah. And some people will probably view that as like a competitor type of thing. Like, I don't want somebody else listening, But in all reality, most people who are listening to podcasts, they're listening to more than one. So when you can do that, I mean, it's crazy when you have that super focused customer base. What a sponsor is willing to pay for, because so many times as a business owner, owning businesses myself and you as well, when you're doing marketing, a lot of times it feels like a hope and pray thing. Like, okay, I'm going to put all this money into even Facebook ads, as targeted as that is now. I'm going to put my money into these Facebook ads and like fingers crossed that people go to my website and that converts into business. But when it's so dialed in, we'll take How to Film Weddings, for example, and you have a company that edits wedding videos for wedding filmmakers, and your audience is 100% wedding filmmakers who need someone to edit their stuff. Like that, it's a no-brainer for advertisers. And so that's really all. As a listener or as a podcast creator, you've just got to find who that is, right? Whoever that is in your niche, that like who's that company that really needs to do business with the people who are really captivated by, whatever content that you're creating. So it's been a really cool thing to experience.
We can't tell you how frustrating it was for us to upload our podcast when we first got started. The websites were clunky, we had data limits, and it was all so confusing. That is, until we found Zencast. Zencast is an online platform built for podcasters to not only upload their podcasts, track their listeners, connect their audience, and so much more. Zencast plans have no upload or download limits, so your cost won't grow as you do. Embed their player that automatically updates to show the latest episode of your show. Zencast lets you see your podcast downloads along with your traffic, website, and Google Analytics. Zencast also supports multiple podcasts under one account. The best part is, if you already have a podcast on another platform, you can switch to Zencast with a one-click importer, all free of charge. So what are you waiting for? Head over to howtomakeapodcast.co/Zencast to start saving time and money with your podcast today. So you've got everything you need for your podcast. You've recorded your audio and video. You're so excited. But wait, you don't know how to master the audio or edit the video of your podcast. We know someone who can help. The podcast editors. Picture this. You record both audio and video for your podcast. You upload it to your remote editor, and a few days later, your podcast is ready for you to upload and push to the world. What will you do with your extra time? Connect with sponsors? Grow your Facebook group? Start that project or even course you have dreamed of for months? The possibilities are endless. We are blown away by the podcast editors and love working with them and using their services. They can edit audio, video, or both for your podcast. Don't get stuck trying to do this on your own. Get in touch with the podcast editors today. If you'd like to save 50% off of your first project, head over to howtomakeapodcast.co/thepodcasteditors.
Tell me about the relationships that you've seen forged between people with your small community podcast, or the relationships you've been able to build with other businesses, and what has been created, generated. Have you made any extra money from that? Has it opened doors for you?
Yeah. So when we went into my pitch with the podcast for them, so I co-host the podcast with the CEO of our chamber. So she's my co-host on that. So when we first pitched the idea, when I originally went to them with it, I was going to do kind of like what we do for a lot of our other clients that we produce for. It was just going to be a package where they pay us to make the podcast for them, and then it's kind of like their baby, and they have the ownership. But I looked at it and I thought, I know who we're going to be interviewing, and like the idea is local business leaders, local community leaders, kind of movers and shakers. I mean, so what it's turned out to be is, our local, like our mayor, like, and our congressman, and our, local politicians and business leaders and people who have like done phenomenal things entrepreneurially. And so I looked at that, I was like, those are the kind of people that we want to do business with, in our business. So I made a deal where most chambers are nonprofits. A lot of people don't know that, where they keep a majority of that in exchange for us, where we're making connections that are just absolutely insane for us. So we've got some political podcasts in the works now with guests of ours that were on the show. I mean, just that's been a huge payoff for us with just some of the connections that we've made, for sure.
Yeah, I love it. And so you have this podcast, we've got these listeners out there. What kinds of things come to your mind when it comes to different types of ideas? If people are podcasting right now, maybe they want to start a different podcast, or maybe they're thinking of getting going with something more on I wouldn't say super niche, but like a pretty close to a super niche podcast. Any ideas or thoughts come to your mind for different types of businesses, things like that?
So something that's been really fascinating to me as we've started to produce podcasts for other people is how many businesses are interested in having their own podcast. So whatever it is that you're interested in, so I mean, just pick a random thing. So let's say golf. Like I love golf. I love to play golf. I like to watch golf for whatever reason. Like that sounds like it'd be the most boring thing in the world, but I enjoy watching it.
Yes.
But like say you're really, really interested in golf and you want to make a golf podcast. There are some really great golf podcasts out there that are absolutely crushing it. Shout out to No Laying Up if you've never listened to that, if you happen to be a golf fan. But you look at something that you love, right? So find something that you're passionate about, whatever you want that podcast to be, and look within that area and try to find some businesses that you think like, hey, they would like kill it with a podcast. Like I haven't even looked at it, but off the top of my head, a brand that I really admire is Yeti, the cooler company that makes Yetis. I think it's crazy that they've built a brand where people will pay $400 for a piece of plastic that's nominally better than something that's 100 times cheaper. But they built this fantastic brand. But they may already have one. I haven't looked at it, but this is off the top of my head. But somebody like that, like if you're an outdoors person, that's a kind of situation where you create these cohesiveness strategies with people, because there's these businesses they want that, and they're seeing how fast podcasts are taking off. And to be fair, it's getting crowded. Like, sure, so there's getting to be a lot of podcasts. Yeah. We kind of say whatever you're interested in. There's probably already 3 or 4 podcasts about it, but you look them up, a lot of them are dead. Like there's 3 or 4 episodes in. But that's what I would say is try to find a business that's out there, and take whatever you're passionate about, and if you have the ability to produce it. Because there's a little bit of a barrier to entry, right, in the podcast. It's different than creating a YouTube channel where it's like 3 clicks and I'm on YouTube. So I think a lot of people, businesses included, like the businesses that we produce podcasts for, it's not that it's extremely difficult, but they want that guidance. They want somebody to hold their hand. So if you're in that world, I mean, find somebody that you think's got a really cool brand or a really cool story that you can get together with, and then that just kind of rolls into your ability to sponsor as well.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking about if I'm a real estate agent, or if I'm like a gym owner, or if I'm just any kind of business owner, like I'm just thinking to myself, like especially, I don't know why realtors keep coming to mind, but if I'm a realtor and I'm a Tulsa realtor and I create a Tulsa real estate podcast geared toward local families trying to find homes, or the community, and just like updating, creating a podcast about Tulsa and what's going on in Tulsa, what school districts are going well, what, just like niching it down to my town or whatever. Or if I'm a fitness person and I'm literally like Tulsa fitness podcast, and I'm bringing on, like, that's super niche, but like every one of those, there are businesses that I would, think would throw $500 or $800 a month toward if I'm a realtor, it's like, oh, well, what about a bank that I work with all the time? Or if I'm a fitness person, it's like, oh, well, what about this supplement company? Or, like there's all kinds of ways that you can monetize. And a lot of companies have much larger budgets. We work with Music Bed, and they're a bigger company that's doing multiple 7 figures on their business. So to throw a couple $1,000s a month towards a wedding related podcast, like it has paid off for them, number one, but number two, it's like a pretty easy decision for them to say, yeah, it's worth like $25,000 of our marketing budget for the year.
For sure.
But that's life-changing to a small, like somebody that's working a 9 to 5 that just wants to get out of it.
Yeah.
And there's no limit even on, like, I have 2 podcasts, How to Make a Podcast, How to Film Weddings. And I'm always like, well, I could start a podcast about this. I could start like, once you get going, I mean, you could have 3 or 4 podcasts if you're spending 20 hours a month on a podcast. It's like, well, you work 40 hours a week at a job. It's like you can handle 2 podcasts a week. I'm not saying you need to go start 10 of them, but it just makes me as an entrepreneur think like, so many people think that you have to have such a huge audience, and there's such this barrier before you can actually make money. And as people pour in from How to Make a Podcast, showing that like, oh, I have this, I'm already getting monetized. It's very, very encouraging.
Yeah. And I love that you talked about that, like the real estate example, the local community example. They all have these like branches on a tree, right? That it just all spreads out. So to go back to the real estate example, where banks are interested in this and appraisal companies are interested in this, and people who are potential real estate investors are interested in this. And when you look at these small businesses, they're spending money on marketing dollars. I mean, they're spending, even some of the smallest businesses, they're buying billboards for, 4 figures a month to, that they, shotgun approach. It's not super targeted marketing. So it's not outside of the realm of possibility for for even small businesses to spend money on podcasts, especially because it feels new, it feels fresh, it feels different than things that they've tried before. Like, go find a business that's still spending money on the phone book and say, stop spending on the phone book and let's put a little money in the podcast. And you and I had an interesting conversation yesterday, just kind of about growing wealth and growing entrepreneurially, and so much of it is just about your own mindset and your own what you expect to happen out of it. And I definitely encourage people, like, sometimes it's easy to sell kind of out of your own pocket of like, man, I wouldn't pay $2,500 a month to sponsor a podcast, but there are a lot of people who will, and it's really surprising what you can do out there.
Yeah, and before we wrap up, it's just like I'm sitting here thinking, just on the line of a Tulsa area podcaster,
I couldn't hear.
Okay. I'm not cutting that out.
All right, cool. Sorry.
Hi, Siri.
Siri decided she wanted to jump in on this.
Like, I'm just thinking about, like, if I'm a real estate person in Tulsa, like, this is just a random idea, but like restaurants want in, like, you could locally own all kinds of businesses. There's so many things that are parallel. And as a realtor, I'm doing business with this mortgage company anyway. It gives me an opportunity to promote them, but I'm offering a service to Tulsa families, and people are sharing, and then it's just this growing thing. There's a million ideas like that when it comes to the smaller niche stuff. Now, I know I could sit here and talk to you forever.
We can.
But our time is up today.
It is.
Where can people find you?
Yeah, so if you want to chat, I love talking podcasts. I love talking business, marketing, entrepreneurship, anything you want to talk about. So most active on Instagram, just at Blake Pollino, BlakePollino. On Instagram, you can find me there. BP Media Group is our commercial brand that also produces a lot of the podcasts that we do. But yeah, feel free to look us up there and shoot me a message. You want to talk nerdy podcast stuff? I'm all about it.
He gets down and dirty with the nerdy podcast.
I do, and to tech stuff, man. I'm all about it. We're into it.
Blake is the man. I'm so happy that we did meet a few years ago and we become good friends, and that you're here in Tulsa. To those of you listening or watching online, thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate this community as it continues to grow every single month. There's thousands of downloads now, and it's just starting to blow our minds with all the people picking up the podcast blueprint course, purchasing from our template shop, and just continuing to invest into this community. So thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you, Blake, for being here. And until next time, we will see you.
See ya.